Job, chapter 1. Alrighty. I'm going to read a couple verses out of Job, and then if you'd also make a bookmark in Mark chapter 5. We see here in Job that, well, first let's start with, what is faith? Faith is, by definition, having complete trust in someone or something. So we see here in Job chapter 1, verses 14 through the end of the chapter, we see that through all these trials in this time where it says in verse 14, it said, "And there came a messenger unto Job, and said, The oxen were plowing, and the asses feeding beside them. And the Sabeans fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain all the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee." We see through all these verses in the chapter that there's always one person to come back and tell Job what happened. That we see that he started to begin to lose things. He lost his cattle here, then he loses his sheep, starts to lose his wealth. And we see that later in the chapter he loses his children. It says in verse 18, it says, "While he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, Thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in thy eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness, and smote the four corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee." And we see a little later in the chapter where Job's wife comes to him and tells him to curse God and die. But we see that he doesn't. Where it says here in verse 22, "In all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly." We see that through all these trials, through everything he lost, he had that faith in God. He had that trust, that complete trust. And in our Christian life, we should always strive to have that kind of complete trust or that complete faith. Do you have that kind of faith in your life? Now, if you look in the other passage of Scripture, Mark chapter 5. Sorry. Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 34, it's talking about the woman with the blood on her. We see in Mark chapter 5, in verse 25, where it says, "A certain woman which had an issue of blood 12 years." She had this blood ailment for 12 years. She went to many doctors and they couldn't help her. They couldn't help her with her problem. Then we see that she heard Jesus was coming. And she had to have that faith that if she could just get close enough to touch Jesus, that she would be healed. She heard he was coming with this great multitude. And she left her house. She left everything she had behind just to get just to get to Jesus so she could be healed. We see that in verse 34, where it says, "Daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace and be whole of thy plague." We see here in these verses that Jesus didn't perform the miracle just because he wanted to perform a miracle. He healed her because her faith. We see it says, "Daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole." What will you do with that kind of faith? Will you be able to have that kind of faith mentally? Will you be able to just leave everything behind and go and trust God? Then also, if you look in the previous chapter, in verses 35 through 41, we see, and it says, "And the same day, when the even was come, he saith unto them, Let us pass over unto the other side. And when they had sent away the multitude, they took him even as he was in the ship. And there was also with him other little ships. And there arose a great storm of wind, and the waves beat into the ship, so that it was now full. And he was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow. And they awake him and said unto him, Master, carest thou not that we perish?" We see here where it's talking about you have the disciples, and they're on the boat with Jesus on the Sea of Galilee. We see that they didn't have faith at this point in time, but we also know that when he went to go get the disciples all together, that they had to have faith because he said, "Follow me and I'll make you fishers of men." And they dropped everything. They left everything behind and said, "I will follow him." Right. But it could be wrong. They could have been wrong. But they had that faith that they were following the right man. So then we see in verse 40, in the end of verse 39, where Jesus says, "Peace be still," and the wind ceased and there was a great calm. And we see, he asked them a question in verse 40, and it said, "And he said unto them, Why are you so fearful? How is it that ye have no faith?" God had to ask them the question, why do you have no faith? We see that they had faith previously. but their faith didn't withstand the trial like Job's faith. Then I would like to tell you a quick story that I heard, to the best of my memory, from ski camp this year. My youth pastor was preaching, and he got up and told a story behind him before he got up to preach. We see it's on the story of, I have decided to follow Jesus. He was saying how a group of Welsh missionaries were going to a group of headhunters to give them the Bible, to give them Jesus. And we see that they had all this time, and all this time that they spent was they weren't getting very far. But then finally one Welsh missionary got to a family, got them Jesus, they became saved. Well, then that chief of that village became furious, became angry. And he dragged that family's wife and children out into the street and had the husband standing there and said, "Renounce your faith or I'll kill your sons." And he answered the chief and said, "I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back." So the chief became angry and killed his sons. Well, then we see later, the next thing he asked him was, "Renounce your faith or I'll kill your wife." We see that he answers the chief, "The cross before me, the world behind me, no turning back, no turning back." We see that he became even more angry and killed his wife. Well, then the chief gave him one more chance, said, "Renounce your faith or it is your life." And that husband answered to him saying, "Though none go with me, still I will follow. No turning back, no turning back." We see that even though they were risking their own lives, they still had that faith put in front of them to test their faith. That chief was there to test their faith. And we see that their faith held out strong. We see that even though there was death in their face, they were willing to do this. And many times nowadays, we have situations that we have our faith tested. But are we going to have that line in the sand that said, "Here's my faith, I will not cross it"? Are we going to draw that line? Or are we going to have that say, here's my line, I will not cross it, and when we're tested, we'll cross it? Are you going to be like the lady with the blood ailment, or Job, or this family? Are you going to have that strong faith? Or are you going to be like the disciples who, when they're tested with some things, they can be easily broken? Are you going to have this strong faith? Will you have that kind of faith in God? What will you choose?
Amen.